Well, thank you all for coming. It's really nice to be here. It's nice to see a number of old friends and new friends as well. And this is really a treat for me to be able to share some of the story from my year in Circumference. I have a kind of custom, I guess you'd say, when we start these, and this isn't in the book, this poem, but I know that a lot of you have been pretty busy today, and it takes a minute to shift gears. And so I want to offer a poem as a way of helping all of us to shift gears. Yogi Berra once said, "We may be lost, but we're making good time." Which describes the way it feels to me a lot these days. And so this poem by David Wagner, Northwest poet, is called Lost. And I'd like to start with this poem. In the poem, the poet imagines that he is a Northwest Coast native boy who's gone to one of his elders to ask, "What do I do if I become lost in the forest?" And these are the words that the elder speaks to the boy. "Stand still. The trees ahead and bushes beside you are not lost. Wherever you are is called here, and you must treat it as a powerful stranger. Must ask permission to know it and be known. The forest breathes, listen. It answers, I have made this place around you. If you leave it, you may come back again, saying, here. No two trees are the same to raven. No two branches are the same to wren. If what a tree or a bush does is lost on you, you are surely lost. Stand still. The forest knows where you are. You must let it find you." I'd like to share that poem also because, in a sense, that's what my year 2008 felt like. It was a year of allowing myself to be found by the place that I was born and raised, and to sort of reconnect with my sense of belonging in this place. I've always had a deep love for the Puget Sound Basin, Puget Sound region, Pacific Northwest. And one of my motives for doing this year was to, I was becoming aware that I was doing quite a bit of traveling outside the region, and also that my carbon footprint was growing bigger rather than smaller at a time when my concern about climate change was really starting to ramp up. So this gap between my convictions about where we are, especially in relation to the climate crisis, and how I was actually living my life, that gap had grown uncomfortably large for me. And at the same time, I was feeling somewhat homeless at times, kind of rootless. And so for some time, I didn't really know what was an appropriate thing to do, because my life, like probably most of us in here, is really bound up in high carbon activities. And in so many ways, we are, we're kind of stuck. So for some time, I didn't really know what was an appropriate thing to do. And I actually found myself experiencing a fair amount of frustration and stuckness by living in that gap. And one morning in the fall of 2006, I guess it would have been, I was having breakfast with a good friend and overheard, at that time I'd seen Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth. Not long before, it had really kind of prodded me, provoked me, and had taken my carbon footprint. And I overheard myself saying to my friend, what would it be like if I didn't get in a car for an entire year? I'm not even sure where that thought came from, but I kind of liked the sound of it. Pretty crazy. And the follow-up question, what would it be like if I spent an entire year within walking distance of home? And the two together kind of grabbed hold of my imagination almost as the words were coming out of my mouth. I went home and I started drawing circles on the map. My home is on South Whidbey Island. That's the center right there. And actually, I'll put this little guy in here. Not that you can see it, but that's home. So that's the center of the circle. And I started drawing circles with different distance circumference. The first one was 50 miles, because I'd heard somewhere that in pre-industrial times, most of us spent our entire lives within 50 miles of where we were born, because that's about as far as it made sense to walk. So initially, I drew a circle that was about 50 miles in radius. It was something like that. Cut the San Juans in half. Didn't get to the southern tip of Puget Sound. So I started stretching it just a little bit, and that's when I made a really cool discovery. Still, to this day, it kind of blows me away, because I had no idea. When I started measuring the distance from my house to different features, and noticed that the summit of Mount Olympus, Mount Baker, and Glacier Peak were all exactly 100 kilometers from my house. 62 miles, but it was 100 kilometers. And when I drew that circle, this is what I came up with. And the circle takes in Victoria, interestingly, takes in the San Juan Islands. It also goes right over Stevens Pass and Snoqualmie Pass. And comes around to just touch almost the southern edge of Puget Sound. So I discovered, to my complete surprise, that where I live on Whidbey Island is at a kind of symbolic epicenter of the Puget Sound Basin. It's exactly halfway between the crest of the Olympics and the crest of the Cascades, southern tip of Puget Sound, through the San Juan Islands. And by my definition anyway, that's a pretty good definition of what the Puget Sound Basin is. So I spent the better part of a year actually setting this up. I had a fair amount of travel that was on the books that I had to do, and I had to convince my wife that this was not completely crazy, and I had to convince myself that this was not completely crazy. So I ordered this map, this sort of special map, which I love because it's got the topographical features much more dominantly than transportation corridors in cities, except for, and the only way I can make sense out of what happened up here is that the Canadians are doing a better job of managing global warming than we are, because apparently there's a fresh glacier that's come down to cover all of Vancouver Island. And you can see the same glacier right along the 49th parallel. It hits a solid wall of hot air and it won't advance an inch further. So I have to explain this to Canadians. It's a great map except for that.
Who made your map?
Well, it's taken from, I ordered it at Metzger Maps. Yep. It's taken from, you've probably seen these, state of Washington, all the states. So this has been my companion, and then during the year that I was actually doing this, which went from the winter solstice in 2007 to the winter solstice in 2008, I decided to start on the winter solstice rather than the first of the year because I wanted to tie the year into the sequence of seasonal transformations as well. So what you see on here, it's not so easy to see from back there. I set up a number of rules for myself. And the nice thing about doing something like this is you get to make the rules just the way you want to. And one of the rules was I couldn't get in a car come hell or high water. I just had to figure out how to do it without getting into a car, mine or anyone else's. So that was the really major sort of limitation. I used public transportation for day-to-day activities and my bicycle. And then I set up a series of adventures during the course of the year where I just started playing with maps in the months leading up and what are some of the places that I've never been to? What are some of the really ecologically rich but maybe culturally out of the way places? What are some of the wounded places? What are some of the power places? Not based on freeways and cities, but the terrain, the topography, and the communities as well. So I came up with a number of different adventures for a week or more out of each month. And beginning with a 130-mile walking trip that I took from home through the Snohomish, Stillaguamish, and Skagit basins, and then down Whidbey Island. I wanted to really explore what was close at hand and not just go off into the wilderness areas. And then the red lines are all different bicycle trips I took. And the blue, and I'll talk about the one that goes outside the circle in a minute, but the blue is sea kayaking. Did about 400-mile circumnavigation of the Puget Sound Basin by kayak in the summer of that year. So the way I set up the book is I divided into 3 sections that I call the boot, the spoke, and the paddle. So I'd like to read a few excerpts from each of those sections, beginning with just a couple of paragraphs from the introduction that talks about why I did this. It was an adventure. It was supposed to be an adventure. But my reasons for doing it went deeper than that. As a source of motivation for serious personal change, global warming has a lot going for it. Its scale and urgency are also its opportunity. Climate change challenges us to anchor personal choices in a more enduring shift in cultural values about what constitutes the good life. Knowing that everything worthy of our love really is on the line, we are much more likely to face the difficult aspects of these shifts with the courage and fortitude we need to stand our ground. We're more likely to stick it out. That's why climate change, arguably the greatest challenge ever to face the human family, will never be far from my thoughts and meditations throughout this year in Circumference, even when the contexts of my adventures are deeply personal and local. If there is a hidden gift embedded in this crisis, it is this potent new motivation to re-examine our lives, to make changes in the direction of more balanced and sustainable living, changes that we have resisted for too long, that our overall quality of life may actually benefit from this effort is a prospect often lost in the public rhetoric about anticipated hardship and self-sacrifice that we've long associated with such changes. The hope now driving me forward is that the opposite may prove to be true. The climate crisis may be our last best chance for a broad-based realignment of values that can finally extend our ethical regard into the deepest heart of the living world. So I'm going to read a couple of short sections from the walking trip, which took me 10 days, and just a marvelous experience. Sally joined me for 3 of those days, and that was something that I really wondered going into the year. How's this really going to affect? How's this going to land? In the context of my marriage, because I was asking a lot of Sally. But when she asked if she could join me for the walk from Stanwood to LaConner for a couple of days, and then later join me on other parts of the adventure, I knew that she was really kind of getting into the spirit of it too, and we had some really wonderful adventures. Some of the best times we've experienced. So this is from the third day of the walk. I was in the Tulalip Indian Reservation, where I'd spent a very cold night camping somewhere in the forest. It was down in the low 20s. There was no lodging. I didn't know where I was going to end up on any particular day, and so if I could stay with friends, I did. If I could stay in a motel, I did, but sometimes I just had to camp. It feels as if I've been waiting days for the first glimmers of dawn to announce the end of this interminable night in the forest. The great horned owls notice it first, offering soulful, lengthy discourses on the change of light that pull me out of my uneven sleep. Even the soft bed of moss that served as my mattress has gone stiff with the cold. The tarp around my sleeping bag is covered with a heavy frost that pours like sand down a chute into my sleeping bag as I stir myself to rise. I corral my gear quickly into the pack and leave the forest in the same conditions as I arrived, with barely enough light to see and barely enough clothing to hold the cold at bay. And a little later that morning, by the time I reach Kayak Point, the sun has exploded above the forest, turning Port Susan the same cobalt blue as the sky. And the long vista down Possession Sound, a tapestry of islands glinting in the sun. The Olympic Mountains swell in the distance behind Camino Island, displaying their heavy coating of winter snow. I drop down a steep, winding road to the beach, still heavily frosted in the shade of the forest. A bustling campground in summer, the park at Kayak Point belongs all to me on this January morning. A few western grebes and Barrow's golden eyes are feeding in the shallows, diving into the mirrored reflection of mountains that travel with them down into the stillness of the water. The graceful arc of the grebe as it splits the water's surface is one of such effortless artistry that I never grow weary of watching it. I study the weariness in my body with a similar fascination, almost like meeting an old friend again. The stiff muscles that are the cost of coming here on foot Also make the day feel more vibrant and alive. I peel an orange and enjoy a breakfast of bread and cheese while the sun reels itself higher into the sky. A pilgrimage like this one does its job by leavening my abstract questions with the fierce beauty of the moment. It returns a measure of balance to the world by helping to pry the senses open. A couple days later, after Sally and I walked through Fur Island and experienced the massive flocks of snow geese on foot, got to La Conner. Then I continued. Sally caught a train and bus back home, and I continued onto Fidalgo Island and the Swinomish Indian Reservation. And I have a really good friend who is a native elder on the Swinomish Reservation that I was hoping to see. He didn't want me to use his name in the book, so in the book I call him Marvin. And I didn't know if Marvin was there. He never answers my emails or my phone messages. So I just figured, well, I hope he's there. And when I got to his house near the tribal center on the Swinomish Reservation, his wife answered the door and told me that he'd been up all night in the longhouse, the ceremonial longhouse, helping to prepare for one of their big ceremonies. So he was asleep, and I wasn't going to wake him up. So I headed on my way, disappointed for sure. An hour later, a car pulls alongside me on the lonely road and rolls to a stop. It is Marvin, and with a beaming face, he invites me to drive back to his house for a visit. I refused the ride, telling him about my car-free vow and the purpose of my walk through the Skagit. He pulls over to talk on a rise above the Swinomish Channel that has a grand view of the Skagit Valley sprawling away to the east across the water. In spite of the cold, we talk for a long time, catching each other up on the news of our lives. As I tell him about the purpose of my explorations, his eyes brighten, and he gives an enthusiastic nod. "This is a good thing I am doing," he says. "All of us were indigenous once. It's not just the tribes who have a stake in the land. The whole culture is out of balance. The ancestors can feel it when someone is taking steps to restore the balance. It brings them joy. They have been waiting a long time for us to wake up, and they are eager to come to our aid. It's not only for natives that this is true." Then Marvin offers some more specific advice. "What I'm doing this year will not be easy," he says, "and I will feel discouraged at times." He tells me to leave the road when I feel burdened and to walk through the underbrush of forest. Let the sticks and branches sweep against my body to pull the heaviness off. Cedar boughs are especially good for this, he says. And when I cross a stream, I should stop to wash my hands in the water and splash a little on my face to show the waters that I have remembered to be grateful. I know that Marvin is telling me these things because he trusts me and he values my friendship. He doesn't want me to walk alone. And he has a deep conviction that the spirits in the land are there for all of us. It is a part of his own generosity of spirit that he doesn't withhold this tribal wisdom from me. In The Practice of the Wild, Gary Snyder describes the value of these teachings from the perspective of the wider culture. Quote, there are tens of millions of people in North America who were physically born here, but who aren't actually living here, intellectually, imaginatively, or morally. Native Americans, to be sure, have a prior claim to the term native, but as they love this land, they will welcome the conversion of millions of immigrant psyches into fellow Native Americans. When I came back onto Whidbey Island, dropping down through Fidalgo Island and across Deception Pass, I had occasion to reflect on what was starting to happen for me in terms of, at the at the level of my own sort of biorhythms, deep perception, by moving slowly. I actually, people think, often have told me that they expected this book to be about how I managed without my car. And actually, I stopped thinking about my car a couple of weeks into it. It was just off the table. It was not an option. So I wasn't thinking about my car. I wasn't thinking about, how tough this was. I was just, thinking about how I could make an adventure out of, what it was going to be to get from this point to that point without having my car. So actually what started to happen and what the book really becomes about is how my life really began to expand and grow richer when I stopped being managed by my car. And a number of people have told me they were surprised about that. They thought it was going to be, something different in that regard. It's taken me a week of steady walking to cover the wide estuaries that lie in Whidbey Island's embrace. What remains on my circular path is the island itself, stretching from the San Juans deep into the interior of Puget Sound. Crossing the bridge at Deception Pass has begun the homeward arc of my journey, and it feels good to be on more familiar ground. Yet, is it so familiar? An hour's drive by car will carry me the length of the island along the state highway that bisects its center. On foot, it will take 4 days to cover that same distance, and I will be on unfamiliar ground most of the way. I have entered a brand new island 4 days long. And then a little bit later, kind of reflecting on a similar vein, 6 weeks into my year of local living, I can begin to feel the pace of my body slowing down. The inner residue of hurry and restlessness is gradually seeping out of my nervous system. It is a subtle shift, and it has taken this long to begin registering in my conscious mind. I'm able to sit still for longer periods, not because I am more determined to do so, but because I just want to. My mind is more available to what I am seeing, with less wanting of things to be different, less pursuit of external stimulation. I simply see more of what is right in front of me. One of the most obvious manifestations of this shift is the way I can literally feel the geography around me growing in scale and stature. A circle I drew on the map that felt small to begin with and potentially confining seems huge now, since it takes an entire day on foot to cover a small portion of it. So the spoke section. My bicycle, my 10-speed that I had from probably the early 70s had been rusting for a long time in my garage. I might take it out 2 or 3 times a year for a little spin, but I basically hadn't been riding my bicycle for quite a while, and I took the opportunity to get a new bike, which was not an easy assignment, actually. So much had changed. I want to read the epigraph that I have to the spoke section here that I found on a bicycle trivia website. The most efficient animal on Earth, in terms of weight transported over distance for energy expended, is a human on a bicycle. The most efficient machine on Earth, in terms of weight transported over distance for energy expended, is a human on a bicycle. So it took me a while to figure out what kind of bike I was going to get, test riding a lot of them. I'm prone by nature to stick with what I have as long as it still works. So when I do spring for something new, it's a big deal. I could hardly have been more proud riding my new bike home from the shop. The first thing I noticed was how smoothly it handled compared with my old bike. How light it was for hoisting onto a bus rack, and how responsive the shifting mechanisms have become. The second thing I noticed, within a day of bringing my new bike home, was that the technological mechanisms of the bicycle may have improved, but the biological components of the rider had gone seriously downhill. It would have been tempting to put my bicycle back in storage at that point, except that I now have no car to rescue me. This is where a line in the sand comes in handy. I had my vow to live up to, a deeper motivation to hold my feet to the fire, which left me no real choice in the matter but to keep riding. And it wasn't long before I got through that narrow spot and could ride a little further and a little further, which I did. I probably, well, I know I put about 3,000 miles on my bike during the year. That's one of the things that I am really enjoying keeping going. So this book is not, it could have been, but I chose not to make it a spiritual book or to emphasize the, I have a long-standing Zen practice, meditation practice. I teach meditation as one of the things that I do. But I chose to work with that aspect of the year in a light kind of way. But there were a couple of places in here where I talk about the, how my meditation practice really grounded me, which it certainly did and does as I was going through the year. So on one of my bike trips, which I took down, I called it the Inner Sound, biking in the Inner Sound. So I came down from Port Townsend down Olympic and Kitsap Peninsulas, and then over onto Vashon Island and down Vashon, and then across to Tacoma and back up through the urban corridor, the industrial corridor. So I really tried to not just go to the pretty places, the picture postcard places, but I really tried to dive into some of the really wounded places in the Puget Sound region so that I could include that sort of in my sense of what constitutes home and what it's going to take for us to restore a healthy ecosystem in Puget Sound. Interesting, there was a poll taken, I think last fall, where people were asked if they favored a clean Puget Sound, and a big majority of people said, yeah, I favor a clean Puget Sound. But when they were asked if they thought there was any problem with Puget Sound, only 23% thought that there was actually any problem with Puget Sound. So there's a huge gap here between perception and reality, which seems to be part of what makes it so hard for us to muster the personal and political will to really make restoration a priority. But anyway, I stayed with a friend on Vashon Island who is a Zen priest, actually a Zen nun. And there is an amazing temple, private temple complex that she is caretaker of on Vashon, where this temple had been dismantled in Indonesia, shipped over and reassembled, just as unbelievable temple grounds. And so I spent a night with Joseon. And it snowed that night. It was April, but it snowed. It was really cold that fall. And so I want to read just a couple paragraphs here. In the morning, I'm up before dawn to join Joseon for meditation in the temple. To our surprise, the rain has turned to snow during the night, lacing the temple grounds with a generous resurgence of winter. We wrap ourselves in extra layers of clothing and make our way through the slush-filled darkness, lighting candles in the temple and settling wordlessly onto our cushions as we have 1,000 times before. With the temperature hanging just above freezing inside and out, we chant familiar Zen sutras with puffs of steam billowing from our mouths, then fall into a silence made deeper by the heavy blanket of snow. No sound touches the morning stillness, except for the steady drip of meltwater from the temple eaves, and the prosaic song of a few hardy robins as light comes on, who stand by their conviction that spring has actually arrived. More than anything else, I treasure the islands of silence that meditation offers to my wearied mind, hounded as it is by a culture of excessive noise and distraction. Such a discipline of practice may be challenging on a cold morning like today, but it offers a refuge that I would not trade for anything. A chance to drop below the mind's interminable self-preoccupation to a deeper bedrock consciousness that is part of our universal human endowment. The Romanian historian of religion, Mircea Eliade, posited that the source of religious awe arose when conscious humans first looked up and saw the stars. I think it may have happened when those same early humans looked inside for the first time and saw the stars reflected there. And then the next day was my urban plunge, I guess you would call it. Crossing the ferry to Point Defiance from the southern tip of Vashon Island. The ferry actually comes in basically right next door to a Superfund site. The site that was the Asarco smelter that some of you, if you grew up here, will remember. The smelter stack has been taken down with dynamite, but that smelter to this day has left 1,000 square miles of of King and Pierce and Kitsap counties with, unacceptably high levels of heavy metals like arsenic. And it's a big problem. And then the Duwamish River watershed is the estuary, what's left of the estuary. There's only 1% of the original Duwamish estuary that's still intact, but that's now a Superfund site 5 miles long, you might know. And a Superfund site is, the federally designated toxic area or toxic site that needs federal assistance for cleaning up. So on this day, I rode the 50 miles from the Asarco smelter through the industrial flats of the Puyallup River and up through the industrial corridor of the White and Green River valleys and then out the Duwamish. It was a pretty amazing day. I dubbed it bicycle hell. I chose a route that went through the most heavily industrialized area that I could find, and a lot of those roads were truck routes with constant traffic of semis, no shoulder. So I want to read just a little bit from that section. The interurban bike trail traces an unbending path along the railroad grade through the baseline of the valley. This is the White and Green River Valley. It seems to have found all the backyards of these industrial parks, the vacant lots that stand in between, and the rear alleyways of remnant neighborhoods that line the edges of our burgeoning industrial project. I stopped to rest by a pocket of wetlands hanging off the edge of an industrial fill. Some bufflehead ducks are working the ponds, inhabiting them with no questions asked. As I watched them work, their lovely black and white bodies diving down to feed and then popping randomly back to the surface of the water, I noticed that the clouds have broken open. It was pouring rain all that day. I am the prodigal son again, aware for now simply of my grief, aware of its potency, aware of its gravitational pull on my body, but aware also that it carries some part of the answer I've come here to find. We will not work to save that which we do not love, wrote E.O. Wilson. The valley stretches out the same as before when I resume my ride. The clouds press down as hard as they have all day. But my spirit is no longer so burdened, my heart not so closed. I'm no longer quite so blind to the beauty that will never cease looking for a fresh purchase on this land. One of my adventures was to attempt to climb one of my 3 circle peaks from home to summit and back under my own power. And I couldn't do Mount Olympus because I would have had to go around from the west up the Hoh Valley. And Glacier Peak has been access to the Glacier Peak Wilderness from the west slope has been basically eliminated by a series of floods that have taken the access roads out, at least at that time. The standard route up Glacier Peak is up the Whitechuck River Valley to Kennedy Hot Springs, and that was just completely obliterated by a flood in 2003. So you still can't get there from here. So I decided not to do Glacier Peak, even though that's the one I wanted to do. So I rode my bike to Mount Baker, the Boulder Glacier side, which the Boulder Glacier is on the south, kind of east side of the mountain. This is one of the places where I cheated and used a surrogate car. Even though I rode my bike up there, I left my pack in my garage with my climbing gear, ice axe, crampons, rope, all that stuff, and it was picked up by my climbing partners who took me 2 days to ride up there to the trailhead, and it took them probably 2-3 hours, and we arranged it so we got there about the same time. I want to read just a little bit from that experience. So they got there just a little before dark. We hiked in a couple miles, set up camp. In the morning, we waked to the penetrating hammer of a pileated woodpecker working a dead snag, the sound echoing across the forest. I feel as if I have traveled 1,000 miles through the country called sleep. A thick and misty fog envelops me as I step outside my tent, sending shivers through my sleep-warmed body. We boil water for a hasty breakfast of oatmeal and tea, packing our gear ahead of the rain that seems sure to follow. By the time we are back on the trail, the mist has indeed given way to rain, and the trail has given way to snow. We are now navigating by dead reckoning and by compass, without the evidence of a trail to guide us. We pick our way through ravines that have begun to shed themselves of forest, and we leave the forest behind for good when we mount the final ridge that will bring us to the lip of the Boulder Glacier. It's raining hard and steady now. We travel in silence, no one wanting to name the discouragement we are all feeling. The ridge narrows as we climb, falling steeply off to the left into a wide chasm of snow and scoured rock that rises to a far ridge, shrouded in fog. The bones of the mountain left naked by the recent departure of receding glacial ice. On the right, we angle toward a vertical rock wall that we must soon ascend to reach the glacier. At the top of the ridge, a small bergschrund has formed where the snowfield has melted away from the rock face, leaving a precipitous gap between opposing walls of snow and rock. This we manage without difficulty. I know we are on the right track when I spot the climbing rope that has been set in place by wilderness climbing rangers. The rock face presents a single pitch of Class 5 climbing, made extra slick today by the rainwater coursing down its face. The rain intensifies as we fasten ourselves to the rope one by one and start up. And a couple of brief readings from the paddle section. This trip to Cowichan Bay on Vancouver Island, I paddled from Possession Point on south end of Whidbey Island up Saratoga Passage, Skagit Bay through Deception Pass, and then up to Anacortes. And then my daughter, Kristen, and a couple of other friends joined me in Anacortes for the trip through the San Juans and across Harrow Strait into Canadian waters. And then Cowichan Bay that summer was the site of a major native canoe rendezvous. And I figured that if these canoes. There were 100 plus seagoing canoes that converged on Cowichan Bay, a tribal reserve. And from as far north as Haida Gwaii, Bella Bella, as far south as the Oregon coast, outer coast of Vancouver Island. So I figured if they could do that, I could leave my home circle. And it was actually a way of symbolically crossing this border that has cut the Salish Sea in two or three. You've probably heard of the bioregional designation for Puget Sound, Strait of Juan de Fuca, and Georgia Strait, the traditional terrain of the Coast Salish people, which now is actually being called officially the Salish Sea in British Columbia. And there's a movement afoot to redesignate this larger region as the Salish Sea. I've been 3 days on the paddle when I reach Hope Island in Skagit Bay. The steady swish and swing of the stroke is gradually taking residence in my body like a physical chant that pulls my mind to the margins of time. I'm too immersed in the repetition to notice how monotonous it is. In the ancient logic of travel across water, reverie seems to win out over boredom in the end. Small things reach out to grab and hold my attention. The pattern of tiny eddies from each paddle stroke as they recede into my wake. The lift and sway of the kayak in the choppy waters. The tide rips that keep my senses alert. Deception Pass is right around the corner, where Skagit Bay gives out into the open water of the Strait of Juan de Fuca. And the current can clock 8 knots at peak tide going through the pass. The narrow neck between Hope Island and Alla Spit offers my first clue that the acceleration of current has begun. Crossing Harrow Strait, about a 6-mile crossing. We set off in calm winds in the morning, skirting the narrow channel between McCracken Point and Battleship Island that issues us out into the open waters of Harrow Strait. To the south is the yawning expanse of the Strait of Juan de Fuca with distant alpenglow over the snowfields of the Olympic Mountains, 40 miles away. Everything about this place feels big and slightly menacing. Forests of bull kelp send their bulbous heads and long sweeping fronds in the direction of the current, helping us gauge its bearing and speed. Halfway through our crossing, the wind kicks up suddenly from the south, coming up the long fetch of the strait, and a sharp swell is not far behind. Soon, the wind is blowing steady at 15 to 20 knots, and we find ourselves wedged in the narrow trough of the waves. We plant and pull with each stroke, plant and pull, rising and falling like tiny corks, our paddle strokes offering the only traction and stability that we have on the water. The swell begins to crest in whitecaps that rise up beside us, but there's no turning back. From my vantage so close to the water, the other boats appear and disappear in the alternating peaks and troughs. Each stroke is a running conversation with the wave at hand, and there are no two waves alike. Braced by the cold, salt wind, we push ahead. The same wind that blows the lid off these waves blows our sense of time out the window. Almost without realizing it, we pull the distant shore ever so slowly towards us. And I'll close with this paragraph after completing the circumnavigation of Whidbey Island, which I did with my daughter Kristen and a couple of other friends, and my gill netter, the Martina, was moored at that time up in Cornet Bay. So walking, biking, and paddling through Deception Pass, I had a nice place to stay. In the morning, my companions head back into the city to rejoin busy lives. I sit alone again at the galley table. As gusts of wind heel the boat over against its mooring lines, I feel glad that we chose to push on last night through those final 10 miles of exposed shoreline despite our weariness. I am right where I want to be in this storm. The charts I have spread out on the table are filled with detail and nuance that they didn't have 9 months ago. They depict a broader landscape, more intricate channels, subtler islands and currents, more intriguing river towns and deltas, foothills and hidden valleys that pour out of the markings on the map and into my living memory. 100 new adventures cast themselves upon my imagination as I pore over the charts. How could I ever be bored inside this circle again? So if you like questions or thoughts in what's called to mind from the readings. The way I made this work, it's an obvious question, was a lot of my work is outside the circle at that time, especially Alaska in the summertime, which I didn't do that year, and other parts of the country. So I took a sabbatical from leaving the circle, which meant that I took a big hit of income during that year. So I continued what I could continue, and I also began a process of transitioning to doing more locally based work. I work at the VA hospital teaching yoga and meditation to vets as stress reduction, 1 day a week. I kept doing that, but it was a sabbatical. I had to treat it as a kind of self-styled sabbatical. That's right. The whole perception of time it has to be altered in some ways if we're going to use public transportation. It takes more time. It's not as convenient, quote, unquote. But the way I experienced it during my year was that travel became lived time rather than lost time. If you define the act of moving from point A to point B as lost time, then that really changes. There isn't continuity between the places where we're spending our time. Rebecca Solnut talks about the scattered interiors of our lives, the office, the home, the store, and there's nothing that connects it. We're just sort of, we're parcels in transit. And so one has to decide that it's important enough to participate in the act of travel as a psychological as well as physical act in order to get over this notion that anything that slows us down is bad and to be avoided. Yeah, what parts of my year have I kept going? It was never my intention to stop using cars completely. I wanted to see if it was possible to do it for me, because I figured if I couldn't do it, nobody can. You know, with the convictions that I have, and you know, so I needed to find out if I could do it, and I didn't know sitting into the year if I could. But I use, basically, there's kind of a hierarchy that I'm trying to maintain of options. If public transportation is a reasonable alternative, I use it. And what constitutes a reasonable alternative is very much expanded over what it was from before the year. And I know what the public transportation options are, and I didn't know a lot of them before. If my bicycle is an option, I really try to use it. And if I use my car, I try to carpool as much as possible. And you know, we drive the best available technology, you know, the lowest emission technology. So all of those, I think, figure in. I've maintained my pattern of not flying on jets, and that really limits me. But so I take the ferry when I go to Alaska. I take the train if I go back east, and so I don't do it very often. And I have to really, there has to be a really good reason to do it. And I'm not just sort of randomly out of restlessness or boredom or, you know, getting on jets to go to other places. So that, and that hasn't been so hard for me to do, because I really shifted, and in some of the ways I talked about and read about, I really shifted my sense of the richness of where we are. I still love cultural diversity, and I'm sure I'm not done traveling, but it's not going to be frivolous travel. So.
How about food?
Food. Well, we have a really good garden at home, vegetable garden, and so we've always eaten locally as much as we can. But I'm very aware, I'm much more aware because of this experience and because of taking the carbon footprint and reading, you know, Michael Pollan's books, Omnivore's Dilemma and so forth, what a huge piece of our carbon footprint our eating habits are. You know, I mean, most people just have no idea. The average bite that, you know, travels to our plate 1,500 miles, and very high carbon production, high carbon packaging, all of that stuff. So, as Michael Pollan says, I'm really aware that our food is marinated in crude oil. So that's, and actually our food choices have as big an impact on global warming as our transportation choices. They're comparable. Yeah, and you know, the local food, slow food kinds of an organic movement, and community-supported agriculture, and the expansion of farmers markets and all of that. That's all really making our lives richer. You know, it's an improvement. So I'm, you know, I have a long ways to go, but I've made some, you know, some strides in both of these regards. Yeah. One or two, a couple more. Yeah, Scott.
How much injury time off did you take?
Injury time off. You know, I've been taking injury time off lately. I think that I probably stripped a few gears during that year. My knees are not so, but I can still ride my bike, and during the year I was actually amazed how what my body allowed me to do. I really didn't know. Like, you know, riding home from Mount Baker, I rode from Mount Baker home in one day. That was 115 miles. I had no idea that I could do that. It wasn't my intention. I was gonna get a place, get a room somewhere in Arlington or someplace. But it was a beautiful evening. I was on a roll, and I just kept going, and I rode all the way home. So you got to work up to it, and I worked up to it, for sure. Yeah, Scott.
Talk about it being an adventure. I remember you talking about your first day.
Yeah.
Adventure.
Yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit about
Oh yeah. There were a lot of days that were not much fun. And the first day actually of the walking trip, which was my first major adventure, was a wake-up call. Walking on the highway at rush hour with a pack, and it's pouring rain, sleet, and the cars are just whipping by one after another, and wait, this is not a walk in the park. I was my boots and socks, I was soaking wet by the time I got to the ferry, which was 4 miles, first 4 miles, first time I'd ever walked to the ferry. Yeah, I was seriously wondering at that point whether, yeah. And there were certainly other times. I mean, it was challenging. Don't get me wrong. It was really challenging. What I found myself doing, and I still find myself doing this a lot, when it gets really tough or inconvenient, I remember why I'm doing it. And I needed that motivation. I needed really strong motivations. A New Year's resolution is different from a vow. And if this had been a New Year's resolution, I never would have stayed with it. Yeah, so I just figure, well, if it's inconvenient taking the bus today, how convenient is a 20-foot rise in sea level going to be? Which is a very likely scenario if we are not able to make some pretty significant, really, really significant shifts in our patterns of living. Yeah, so I think we'll stop there. Thank you all very much again for coming. I'll stick around to sign books for anyone who would like that. There's some for sale out here, but really enjoyed being with you tonight, and yeah.